Hi, and welcome to another edition of Studio 411. I'm your host, Larry DeSilva. We've got an interesting show today. We've actually got a football Hall of Famer among our two guests joining us, but we're going to be talking baseball. We're going to be talking Chicago Cubs baseball for those of you who are from the Midwest or maybe are Easterners now with a longing for the Windy City. As you well know, it's been a bear being a Cubs fan, and I don't mean a Chicago bear, a Chicago Cubs fan, but we're going to be talking about a new book geared at young adults called Go Cubs Go, Baseball's Never Give Up Story, with illustrations by Rob Peters, special contributor, our old friend George Castle, one of Chicago's most renowned baseball historians, and the author of Go Cubs Go, NFL Hall of Fame coach Marv Levy. George, we'll start with you. Welcome to back to Studio 411. How are you?
Great. It's great to be back, Larry, and I got a fresh haircut just for your show.
Very good, very good. All can see all of our viewers. Coach Marv Levy, a pleasure. Thank you for joining us, and quite a change talking baseball instead of the gridiron.
Well, that is true. I was blown away when the publisher of Ascend Books called me the day after the Cubs had clinched the World Series. Wanted to know if I'd be like to write the text for, he called it a children's book on the Cubs. He had known that I had been at the last Cubs World Series game back in 71 years earlier, back in 1945. How he knew it, I don't know. But it was a delight to do it, to work with George and with the people at Ascend Books, and to continue to be talking about it now. And I'm much smarter writing books than I was coaching on the sideline, by the way.
Well, you did pretty well going to 4 Super Bowls. Again, member of the NFL Football Hall of Fame in Canton, Ohio, so not too shabby, as they would say. You mentioned earlier, and I had read in some of my notes, you back in 1945, you were in the middle or just kind of wrapping up your military service. Tell me what that must have been like in those days, and you were at Game 7 of the 45 World Series that the Cubs, unfortunately, did not prevail in.
Yes, that's right. World War II had just ended about 3 weeks before. I was in the Army Air Corps during World War II. I was home on furlough, and a friend of mine, another guy in service, we listened to Game 6 on the radio. There was no TV then, and the Cubs won it, put it to the 7th game. We rushed down to Wrigley Field, see if we could get tickets. The line was out of sight, but they moved everybody in uniform up to the front of the line, so we were able to buy tickets. They cost a whopping $1.10 back then. If we hadn't been in uniform, it would have been $1.25. But the Cubs lost the game, as you know. We never dreamed it would be 71 years till they returned to the World Series, but it was.
And now you took away some of my thunder with the ticket prices. I was going to say, who was the Cub announcer or announcers? Do you recall back in those days in the mid-'40s?
I sure do. The Cubs games were broadcast on all 3 major stations in Chicago at that time, and the announcers were Bob Elson, Hal Totten, and Pat Flanagan. Those are the guys on the 3 separate stations, and everybody had their favorite. They were all good.
Is that you talking, George, or is there a dog in the room?
There's my quote.
All right, so we have a ringer in the room, so we'll have to make do. Very good. We got a little trouble with George's mic, but he'll join us from time to time. Tell me, the publisher of Ascend Books, what's his name? Because I know we have a still of the 3 of you.
His name is Bob Snodgrass, and they had published some previous books that I had written. A novel called Between the and so, but he caught me totally unaware with that call and asking, and it was fun. And then they provided a wonderful illustrator, and then George appended a history of the Cubs that was so magnificent to add to the book.
I was going to say, for quite a few years, at least 30 to 40 years that I can remember, and I know you go back to even collegiate football coaching, I'm sure it would have been very difficult, other than maybe over a quick coffee, to peruse the papers and follow what the Cubs were up to. Although I'm sure in those earlier years, the recruiting and coaching frenzy was not quite as hectic as it is now in the NFL.
Well, I think it seemed to me to be. No, I didn't get to many Cub games. I did now and then. Somehow or other, I developed a friendship because I happened to eat in his restaurant one night with Harry Carey, the renowned Cubs announcer during those interim years. And through Harry, I got to meet and become very friendly with some outstanding Cub players of that era, like Ryne Sandberg, Ernie Banks, Billy Williams, to name a few.
Oh, some top folks, and in the second half of our program, we'll be talking with these two gentlemen, going over some memories I'm sure that each one of us has, even though, again, I'm here on the East Coast. Certainly recall from the mid-'60s onwards, many of the great Cub players, and we'll talk a little bit position by position. Getting back to the book, Go Cubs Go, we have a critic in the room there, but I don't think that was George. Tell me now, did you come up with the storyline yourself? Because I thought to myself, maybe Grandpa Bruno, who is the bear in the book, maybe that's modeled after you in real life.
You got it. Strangely enough, yes. The approach was of, I don't know honestly, if Bob Snodgrass recommended that as the approach. I think he did, of a old bear who knew the history a little bit, and they wanted a bear. So, but I patterned it after my experiences. Not completely my experiences as a Cub fan, and then the two little grandkids, even as old as I am now, I have two little grandchildren, 8 and 2, and I patterned them in as Grandpa Bruno's two grandkids who became enamored with the Cubs because of their grandpa's enthrallment with it.
Gotcha. So again, it's kind of almost a little autobiographical from a bear point of view, perhaps. There you go.
Well, a little bit, but I think it's like maybe 21.3%.
There you go. And the illustrator Rob Peters did a nice job with the book. So again, quite an effort on the part of all you guys. George, tell us, how did you get involved with the project?
Well, I initially got involved in the project trying to do a similar narrative, but Bob Snodgrass thought that my historical knowledge would be better in terms of going that route and also providing a glossary of Cubs terms. So I think it ended up with a wonderful team here. Marv was the pulling guard, and I was, doing the blocking for everybody, and I'm just, following them through the hole. And I think it was a great team effort. And there's no way in the world I could have done that fairy tale that Grandpa Bruno and his two bear grandchildren could have done. I'm just too real life. I'm like Mike Schmidt hitting game-winning homers against the Cubs in the 10th inning in football-sized games, or watching the Bartman game, things like that. So I'm too much in realism, and I guess Marv was an English literature major, so he can go into flights of fiction.
There you go. Now, speaking of Mr. Bartman, again, we're talking with Marv Levy and George Castle about the book Go Cubs Go. Again, a young adult children's book, but again, discussing, of course, the 2016 Cubs victory against the Cleveland Indians, their first World Series in nearly a century. I just read recently that in 2017, the Cubs, I believe they've done it already, they gave Steve Bartman, who became kind of the GOAT of the, I believe it was, 2003 or 2004 playoff.
October 14, 2003, he was down the left field line. I was up in the aux box to to the right field side of the press box, and all we could see was some confusion far away and the most catastrophic loss in Cubs history. So I'll fill in the blanks here, Larry. The Cubs finally closed the chapter, or so they thought, by giving Steve Bartman a World Series ring. They've been giving ushers and ballpark employees World Series rings, and so they thought that this would provide some closure. I disagreed. A lot of people seeing my post agreed with me. Somebody high up in the Cubs organization, starting with then President Andy MacPhail, who's now running the Phillies, should have gone to Bartman soon after that, absolved him, and told the fans and media to back off, because the man has suffered in anonymity for 14 years. He's sort of like the author who makes himself scarce. Greta Garbo, I want to be left alone. There's no way this man should have been made to suffer, and 14 years later ended up getting a ring. Should have been absolved on a list of 10 GOATs for the Cubs collapse that night. He was number 15.
Wow. Marv, any thoughts on that? Do you recall that game?
Well, I recall the game, yes. I had a chance to watch it. I recalled the game. I recalled the heartbreak that it broke to the Cubs, and the Cubs brought to the Cubs and the Cubs fans, and certainly to Steve Bartman. I've never met him or had any communication with him, but I felt for him. And without delving into it, I'll let George, he expressed himself and expressed himself well. But I'm glad that the fence has finally been mended, and the Cubs fans have forgiven him. And it's time to move on and get into that 2017 season for everybody.
Absolutely. And I'll tell you, I was familiar with the play, but really had not seen, the attempted catch by Moises Alou in that 2003 game. But a year or two ago, I saw a documentary that ESPN did. I think it was part of their 30 on 30 series. And actually, that wound up opening the wound all over again. So, I mean, the poor guy, after you thought, at least those of us who maybe were not as familiar with it, I think it must have been shown about 100 times during that documentary. And I thought, this man's going to be crawling back under a tarp again,
Yeah.
ESPN had already opened that wound, Larry. ESPN reporter Wayne Drees stalked Bartman, lay in wait in his company parking lot, and tried to interview him after he knocked off work one night in 2005. He should not have been allowed to do that, and Wayne Drees should have been rebuked by the management of ESPN, but they allowed him to, for sensationalistic purposes, bother the poor soul, and that's one of the reasons why he should have been absolved by Andy MacPhail, Moises Alou, team leader Kerry Wood, some combination of Cubs immediately after this.
Sure, absolutely. Anyway, enough on the Bartman. Back to Go Cubs Go with our guest, sports author, historian George Castle. For more information on what George is up to, chicagosportsmuseum.org. And Mr. Marv Levy, Coach Marv Levy.
Can I correct you on that? Can I correct you, Larry?
Yes, absolutely, yeah.
Took down that address wrong, but, he is without sin should cast the first stone. It's ChicagoBaseballMuseum.org.
Thank you.
ChicagoBaseballMuseum, one word.org.
Very good. And Coach Marv Levy, NFL Hall of Famer, best known for his years with the Buffalo Bills, the author of Go Cubs Go. And Marv, I'll try his, make sure I get that right, www.marvlevy.net for more information on what Marv is up to these days. Marv, getting back to the book, again, kind of tell the viewers a little bit about the kind of the theme, or what you're trying to convey to those young people who are reading the book. Again, what's the main themes in the book about?
I'll tell you what the main theme is, and then I'll expand. The main theme is never give up. And that was the story that Grandpa Bruno tried to get across to his two young grandchildren, and he used the Cubs as an example that they came so close, the great disappointments they had, how close they came that they had fought their way but couldn't even get back to the World Series. But the Cubs never gave up, and by the end of the book, one of the things that occurs, and I think in the last chapter, maybe the last page or two, as I recall, is Grandpa Bruno finally asked his two young grandchildren, Angela and Georgie, what did that means the Cubs did what, and they all chimed in, never give up. And that's a story I guess I was trying to convey to young people now, that it's a game, pursue it, enjoy it, and never give up.
Well said, well said. Now, again, the photos that we've seen of you, again, it sounds like you've been busy not only promoting the book at various venues, but also I see you've done some speaking engagements, again, with perhaps some schools and organizations throughout the city of Chicago and surrounding areas.
Yeah, well, I've been very busy. I've had a speaking agent get in touch with me right after I retired, and each year now I imagine I speak to a variety of groups about sports and other issues, so I have been doing some speaking, and believe it or not, on September 2nd, the 72nd anniversary of the surrender of Japan, known as VJ Day, I am going to be at the World War II Memorial, and I've been asked to give the address and to read a poem that comes from a book of poems I wrote about the World War II veterans. So that's an example. I'm staying busy. That's right. I keep saying that retired means you just got new tires and you're ready to roll.
There you go. As I've learned, I'm not at that retirement age yet, but I learned from some wise people over the years that if you do it right, and I'm sure you would agree, the difference between the days coaching is now that you stay as busy as ever. The only difference is you decide what you want to do and when you want to do it.
Well, sure, it's different, but it's challenging, and you've got to stay busy. And I've been fortunate in having the opportunities to. For quite a while, I did some TV analysis for Fox and other networks, and did some Chicago Bears post-game stuff here in my hometown of Chicago. So I've been busy, and it's been enjoyable.
Now, I read somewhere that now, again, with all your activities, and understandably, you've been away from the game for a few years. I know you went back at one point with the Bills as an executive, but you've kind of almost find yourself drifting away where you're not up to date on the week-to-week or day-to-day activities of goings-on in the NFL.
No, that's true. Very true. I mean, I'm not studying for the draft, particularly since I'm not doing TV as well anymore. I'm not studying for the draft. I couldn't name the rosters of everyone. Back when I was coaching, I could name every assistant coach, every trainer and equipment manager throughout all 32 teams in the league. You'd be on top of it. But no, there are other interests that I have, and writing has been one of them. I've written a book of poetry. I've written a memoir. I've written a novel. Go Cubs Go also, and I'm hoping to continue to write maybe another novel.
Very good, very good. George, I see a good writing partner in your future. If you can tailor your next book or one of your next books to maybe do a little history on the Buffalo Bills. There you go. I think, is George still with us?
Oh, wouldn't that be something, going back to Cookie Gilchrist and all that? Marv is a true Renaissance man, and I want everybody who's watching this show to give the man credit for courage. No, he did not serve in combat in World War II. He's giving that address on the 72nd anniversary of VJ Day as a proud veteran. The day after he graduated high school at South Shore High in 1943, rather than waiting for the draft, he and 21 buddies volunteered for the Army Air Corps. Marv put in for pilot training, but his vision just wasn't up to snuff. So this was not a man who was going to sit out the war. He wanted to go where the action was. Unfortunately, his eyesight betrayed him, but he still served our country honorably. And any World War II veteran with us now, we have to doff our caps in honor to them because they literally saved the world.
Absolutely, no question about it.
Thank you for your very kind remarks. I appreciate them.
Hall of Fame coach.
That's the least I can do, Marv, and I would love to have you for a writing partner. And in fact, let me also tell you that my association with Marv certainly did not stop with Go Cubs Go. Marv did the foreword in my next book, which will be released in February after the first of the year, called Champions. It's about people, sports, who have pulled off comebacks in their competitive or personal lives. And what better person to talk about comebacks than the coach of the NFL team, the Bills, to pull off the greatest play in league history against the Oilers in an overtime game in 1992.
And I remember that game. I'd gone to a movie.
What a pleasure it has been to work with you and to get to know you better.
I had gone to a movie on the day of that game, and I went in. The Bills were getting trounced. I come out of the movie, and all of a sudden I'm like, wait a minute, somebody turned the radio up. I said, did they say the Bills won? It was, who was the quarterback in that game? It wasn't Jim Kelly.
A very unusual story. We went into we were a wild card team, so were the Houston Oilers. We had a little bit better record than them. They had beaten us during the regular season, by the way. But we got ready for the playoff game in Buffalo. Jim Kelly, our great quarterback, was injured. He was out. Cornelius Bennett, our outstanding linebacker, was injured. He was out. Our great running back, Thurman Thomas, was injured. He was out. Quarterback was Frank Reich, our backup quarterback.
That's right.
Frank
yeah,
Reich
I remember
was
now.
to lead what was going to be the greatest comeback in the history of the National Football League, and this is a stunner. Not many people are aware of this. In college, he was a backup to Boomer Esiason, and he led the greatest comeback in the history of collegiate football in the Orange Bowl game when his team, Maryland, upset Miami. So Frank Reich was our quarterback that day. That's a long-winded answer, but I thought the accompanying information might be interesting.
No, great story. I wasn't aware of that. I remember Frank playing, but again, it had been, almost a quarter of a century, so I had forgotten who the backup was in those days to Jim Kelly, but certainly in his own right has some great stories to share with his fans and his grandkids, as they say.
All the more reason, guys, for the theme of Go Cubs Go to be never give up.
Yep.
Coach Marv Levy is going to give up just because he's behind by 30-something points. I've been at ball games at Wrigley Field where either the Cubs or the opposition were down by huge amounts of runs. There were games in 1976. The Phillies were down 13-2 in the fourth inning, and if Marv Levy was the Phillies manager, with his attitude, he says, boys, the wind is blowing out, anything can happen, just keep swinging the bat. Mike Schmidt won the game with hitting home run, Phillies 18, Cubs 16. 3 years later, the Cubs are trailing 21-9 in the fifth inning. They rallied to tie it 22-22 in the eighth before Schmidt wins it again in the 10th inning with a home run. So in sports, you don't give up. Never give up. And that's a good message for Coach Marv Levy to impart to young kids first coming up. You don't give up. You keep playing, and you might just be rewarded.
Absolutely, absolutely. Coach Marv Levy and sports historian, author George Castle joining us here for the hour on Studio 411, talking about the Bills a little bit. We're going to be talking more Cubs baseball, as well as their collaboration along with illustrator Rob Peters called Go Cubs Go. We're going to switch gears, and we're going to talk a little bit about bringing both memories and some expertise. Spend a few minutes on each of the positions in baseball, starting with catcher. During your lifetimes, and of course Marv's got the advantage on us, while doing this, it was funny, I found some great players, of course, that were a little before my time. that I couldn't believe, some of the statistics they had. So we'll start with catcher. My pick for the greatest catcher in my lifetime, Cubs catcher anyway, that I ever saw, was Randy Hundley. I know Gabby Hartnett probably would be the choice of most historians, but he goes back to perhaps maybe even the latter part of when George was in the service, not George, Marv rather. Coach, we'll start with you. Greatest Cubs catcher in your memory.
Well, I'm not an historian, but I'm going with Gabby Hartnett, no question. When the minute you mentioned catcher and before you did some of the other comments, he was my guy. I can remember, if I might, just for a second, this is 1938. The Cubs played the Pittsburgh Pirates. The team that won the game, final game of the season, would go to the World Series. They were tied. They sent everybody home from school early. We could listen to the game on the radio. Gabby Hartnett, his career was in the twilight. He was now the manager of the Cubs, but it wasn't even the starting catcher. In the bottom of the ninth, score tied, he sent himself up to pinch hit. The announcer, Bob Elson, said, "Long fly ball." Never said another word for 20 minutes. All you heard was the roar of the crowd, the homer and the gloamin', it's known as. So I'm with Gabby.
And George, I'm going to assume that you're probably going to chime in, although I don't think you saw Gabby play, though.
Yes, I did.
No, but
I'm sorry, George.
Yeah, George. In our neighborhood on Lincoln Avenue, Gabby Hartnett's bowling alley, so that was his sort of like, people running Chevy dealers and whatever. But seriously, Gabby Hartnett is the greatest catcher in Cubs history. He's the only Hall of Fame catcher. And listening to Marv's story, it's amazing what a Cub town it was and is, because they let the kids, sorry about the dogs barking, but that's our sound effects.
I think they're rooting.
Let the kids go home early to listen to the game on radio. In those days, the games began at 3 o'clock. They would dismiss school early, and Marv's father came home from work early. So that's the hold the Cubs have on the city of Chicago, and it's still considered the most historic homer in Cubs history, that homer in the gloamin'. And the interesting thing is that later on they changed the rule so that if a game was about to be called on account of darkness, it would be suspended and picked up from the point of interruption. The rule was now changed for another 28 or 30 years after that, but it became a feature of life in Wrigley Field. So a lot of interesting angles that you don't see elsewhere in baseball, with that homer in the gloaming and in the pre-lights days, games being suspended and picked up at the point of interruption due to darkness.
Coach Marv Levy and sports historian, author George Castle joining us for the hour on Studio 411. Their new book collaboration along with Rob Peters, Go Cubs Go. All right, now we'll move to first base. Again, during my lifetime, and again, interesting, my pick would be Mark Grace. Again, I'm not counting Cap Anson, who I know is one of the greatest players of all time, because that's even before any of our times. Marv wasn't even born when Cap was playing, so putting Mr. Anson
aside. We hope not.
No, well, again, he's very youthful for his age, I got to tell you. But I would say Mark Grace, who many consider should be in the Hall of Fame, but I don't know that he's going to get in. I would say Ernie Banks, I know I thought of that, but Ernie played so many years at shortstop and in the latter part of his years at first base. Coach Levy, any other first basemen that come to mind?
Well, I'll tell you, I'm not good at picking the all-time teams, and I'll tell you why. Because I just didn't study it all that closely. I'm sure I'll drift by somebody who was good. I might go back to pick the guys who were stars during my growing up teenage years and childhood years. And the one that I remember as a great first baseman, there were two of them really from that era. Charlie Grimm was the first, and then Phil Cavaretta, who was also the manager of the 1945 World Series teams. Were great ones. Now, I'm not saying those are the guys because I'm not that knowledgeable on so many of the players that played after that. Maybe a few, and if Ernie, I'm saving for shortstop.
There you go. George, what about you? Mark Grace, Mr. Anson, omitted for old-time reasons?
Yeah, it's a different style of baseball pre-1900, and I'm also going to throw a demerit at Cap Anson because he was a virulent racist. No reason for him to behave like that, and anybody who was like that should be repudiated. Mark Grace, you do have a good point about him. He got the most hits of anybody in the 1990s. The only thing Mark did not do well was hit home runs. He was a tremendous gap-to-gap doubles hitter, would hit 300 to 320 every year, tremendous defensive first baseman, almost in Keith Hernandez's class. In terms of historic first baseman, I'll tell you a quick story here. In 1945, when Marv went to the World Series, Phil Cavarretta was the National League most valuable player playing first base for the Cubs at .355, the batting champ, 6 homers, 97 RBIs. And when I did a baseball radio show called Diamond Gems in 1994, the coach of the Buffalo Bills was gracious enough to take time from busy training camp prep to appear live on the show via the phone from Buffalo. And on phone hookups, I linked him up with both Phil Cavarretta and center fielder Andy Pafko. So 2 of the guys that he rooted for in 1945, he got a chance to talk to live on Diamond Gems, and I thought that was a treat. And he has a tape of the show, and that was something else. But if you talk about a all-time first baseman, Mark Grace gets the edge. Ernie Banks played the last half of his career at first base, but the balance of his best years were at shortstop when he probably was the best player in the National League, even ahead of Hank Aaron and Willie Mays from 1955 to 1960.
Moving on to second base, again, I think the overall pick, as much as I loved Glenn Beckert during the DeRocher years, I think he played with the Cubs about 11 or 12 years, but obviously the overriding choice, I think, on all scorecards would be Ryne Sandberg, although to use George's term, I always took a bit of a demerit. I understand, I think, a little bit better why he, around 1993 or 94, retired abruptly. I guess he was having some personal issues. He did come back, but never really was the same player again. But certainly Hall of Fame second baseman Ryne Sandberg. Any others that you guys can recall that were in that classification, maybe going back to the 40s and 50s?
Well, Marv can certainly give a vote for Billy Herman, who was the incumbent baseman in 1938.
Ryan was my pick, but I certainly would mention in the fight Billy Herman from, again, back in the 30s and 30s mostly.
Third base, again,
you mentioned, of course, Glenn Beckert, and there was a guy whose career flamed out, or certainly was very, very short, killed in a plane crash, piloting his own private plane. National League Rookie of the Year 1962, Kenny Hubbs, set a fielding record, and many say that he would have been a Ryne Sandberg type of second baseman had he lived. Oddly enough, Kenny Hubbs' death paved the way for Glenn Beckert to take over at second. Beckert had been a minor league shortstop and was shifted to second to fill the gap left by Hubbs.
Moving on to third base, again, another Hall of Famer, although it unfortunately did take quite a while. And if I recall, he unfortunately passed a year before he got elected by the Veterans Committee. Guy that was right up there with Brooks Robinson and Greg Nettles, who is not in the Hall of Fame, but guys during my younger years, Ron Santo. Again, did Ron have a nickname, by the way, George?
No, what was that again? I didn't get the part of the question. Can you repeat that?
Yeah, no, I was saying Ron Santo was, I think, probably the universal pick for third base. Did Santo have a nickname that you were aware of?
He didn't really have a nickname, Ronnie or something. He used to own a pizza company called Pro's Pizza, and he would as kids, we would eat the Pros Pizza, and it seemed that the box would taste better than the pizza. But we used to call him Pizza Guy or whatever. But it basically was Ronnie, and he became a very, very much beloved Cubs radio color announcer, so everybody knew him as Ronnie. That's how he finished out his life in the broadcast booth. And I think his biggest achievement, and Marv can back this up because he's dealt probably with a couple of diabetic players, Ron Santo achieved the Hall of Fame in his career playing with unregulated diabetes. He could not determine what his blood sugar was. He would have to only react to symptoms. So if he felt he was going to a coma, he would have a candy bar or a bottle of soda on the bench, or a can of soda on the bench, to give himself a sugar fix. And playing all those day games at home, all those years, was unbelievable. And when he broke into the minors in 1959, they thought of treating Ron Santo's type 1 juvenile diabetes with diet. So it's a miracle that he had such a great career playing in less than optimal conditions while suffering diabetes and purely guessing at what the level of his blood sugar was.
I'll toss this one out at Coach Levy. George kind of made me think of this because of, in those days, for those who don't remember, there were nothing but day games in Wrigley Field because there were no lights until the late 80s. Do you think Coach Levy, especially correlating it with even football, do you think that Ron Santo has won? I remember every year, 96, 98, 96, 98 RBIs. Do you think that he, as well as Ernie and so many of the other great players you've seen and known in your time, do you think that maybe having the ability to play some night games would have not only furthered their careers, but also added perhaps some additional stats to their records?
Well, I'm not going to fake an answer on that one. I tell you, I just don't know. And I did know that I had, again, I wasn't following baseball real closely during those years. I was so involved in my coaching. But I do know, if you would have nailed me down to name the third baseman, it would have been Ron Santo. Again, I'll keep referring back to the guys when I grow up. There was another great one from back then, Stanley Hack was his name, that would at least have to be on the ballot.
Gotcha. George, any thoughts on that? Do you think the lack of some night games maybe to kind of allow them to maybe be a little fresher? Because I know even in '69 when they collapsed during that big Mets year, the Miracle Mets, there was some talk that maybe all those day games, granted they did play night games on the road, in other ballparks, but just that 81 games in daytime Wrigley Field might have taken some steam out of them.
Well, and I've been writing about this for 3 decades. Joe Madden, in fact, just made some comments saying he would like to have even more night games. They are regulated to 46 night games by city law here in order to prevent the surrounding neighborhood from being totally overwhelmed by that. Sorry about those dogs, but that's our sound effects. That's the beauty of being a pet owner here.
I think you're on top of that. I think you're on top of that building that I used to see everybody that used to watch the games for free. I think you're there with the dogs. That's where I think you're on.
Who let the dogs out? But Marv has experienced this, having played on Sunday and then having a Monday night game and then having a quick turnaround. And then it's even more pronounced right now with Sunday night games and then teams playing on Thursday nights. And Marv knows there is an effect with the short rest there in football. But let me tell you about the night game situation. It hurt the Cubs badly because they went some 40 years, from 1948 to 1988, as the only team that could not play night games. The Yankees and the Tigers were the last to install lights in the ballpark in 1948. Kona's digging right in back of me, so we're just inundated by this dog here.
There you go.
Let me tell you, the biggest problem was not the heat at Wrigley Field, but let's say you play an entire homestand of day games. You're basically on a 9 to 5 schedule. Now you go on the road and you're playing 4 to midnight. You're on an entertainer schedule. And it was even worse when he went on the West Coast, particularly back in the 60s when everybody playing night games would start at 8 o'clock local time. So the Cubs would play a whole homestand at 1:30 or 1:15. Then Monday night they'd be playing in San Francisco or LA. And they would start games at 10 o'clock according to the Cubs players' body clocks. They couldn't have shifted that bad. And Billy Williams would tell me, in order to handle the day games, he would go to bed at 10 o'clock each night. He had to get up at 6 o'clock the next morning, 6:30, have breakfast, thank you, Kona, and then drive to Wrigley Field. So Billy Williams, Ron Santo, Ernie Banks are now facing Sandy Koufax, Don Drysdale, and Juan Marichal when their body clocks are telling them to go to bed in that first night game. And they did studies showing their batting averages, their overall offensive production was the lowest in their careers in that first night game on the road. They suffered from what medical experts call shift work disorder. You're shifting from day to night to day to night. If you're a regular person, if you're Larry DeSilva or your crew, you're working days and then nights, and if you kept doing that for 6 months, it would wear you out. Now you're talking about athletes having to be in prime physical and mental condition, having that extra distraction and that extra stress on you. So Phil Wrigley did nobody any favors with this eccentric artificial prohibition against lights. Marv Levy, as a South Shore High School junior, should have been able to see night games at Wrigley Field in 1942. Wrigley had decided to get the lights to install, the steel to install light towers for the 42 season. Then an event called Pearl Harbor intervened, and he donated the steel to the war effort instead. And from then on, as long as Phil Wrigley was alive, never made a move to install lights. So you got the book chapter version of the light story here.
Studio 411, the remaining moments in the hour conversation with our guests, George Castle, author, sports historian, coach, Hall of Fame coach Marv Levy, again, author of Go Cubs Go. And again, having a little baseball roundtable. Coach, let me go to you. One thing when I was doing my research that I was quite amazed, and you touched on it earlier, as did George, but I'll throw this out to the coach. Phil Caravetta, quite an amazing player. 20 years, actually 22 if you count the last 2 with the White Sox. Was in 3 World Series, 35, 38, and 45. 3-time All-Star. Was mentioned earlier, 1945 MVP. Kind of a forgotten Cub, certainly here in this part of the country, but what are your memories of him as a ball player?
Well, I've got a lot of memories of Phil Cavarretta. I don't know if you know it. He was signed as a 16-year-old out of Lane Tech High School in Chicago. My high school basketball coach, a guy named Tony Mayfia at South Shore High School, had been a classmate of Phil Cavaretta's, and Cavarretta used to drop by the high school while I was still there, and I got to meet him way back then. I remember he was a great player, he was a very young manager of the team, was a very friendly, cordial guy, great athlete. All my memories of him are certainly upscale, top notch.
In the remaining few minutes that we have, we'll try to get through the rest of this list. We'll keep the answers a little shorter. Starting
Larry,
pitcher,
can I just jump in a little final anecdote about Phil Cavarretta?
Yeah, go ahead.
He became the Cubs player manager in 1951. So in 1954, Phil Wrigley asked him for an assessment of the team going into the season, and Phil said, "We stink." So Phil Wrigley fired Phil Cavarretta, the first time a manager was ever fired in spring training.
There you go. Let's move on to starting pitcher. I was surprised in some of the research I did that, again, it seems to be the overwhelming love of, and I don't dislike the player, but Greg Maddux. To me, you can show me all the stats you want. To me, the greatest Cub pitcher in my lifetime was Ferguson Jenkins. Again, we'll go to Coach Marv. Share some pitching folk that you recall during your younger years following the Cubs. Give me some highlights.
Okay, I'll tell you some of them. There was Lon Warnicki, Charlie Root from the 29 and 32 team. He's the guy that set up the homer that Babe Ruth pointed out that were quite memorable pitchers on the team back at that time. Pitchers went 9 innings back in those days. The games lasted about an hour and 50 minutes, which I prefer. But there's a couple of pitchers from that day.
George, your thoughts, Jenkins or Maddox?
Well, Jenkins has a record that'll probably not be broken because the style of pitching has changed. 20 or more wins 6 years in a row, and an absolute master of control and endurance. He, in 1971, when Fergie won the Cy Young Award, he had completed 30 out of his 39 starts, 24 wins. That means he had 6 complete game losses. And in his duels with Bob Gibson, the pitcher that he's most compared with, he was 5-3 lifetime and twice beat Gibson in 10 innings. One in 39-degree chill in Wrigley Field. That was my first of 41 straight home openers. Another time on a July 4th blistering day in St. Louis, almost 100 degrees. Fergie's flannel uniform was not soaked in sweat. Gibson looked like he had been dunked in a tank, and he beat him twice in 10 innings. Again, he gave up a ton of home runs, but it didn't really hurt him because he didn't walk anybody in front of him. Now, Maddox would have been the greatest pitcher in Cubs history had the Cubs not bungled him out screwing up his free agent deal. Maddox had told me the previous summer that if they would take care of his contract the following off-season, that he and his wife would buy a house in Chicago. He had no intention of leaving the Cubs.
There you go. And later in his career, he wound up coming back for a few years at the tail end. But again, my money for a game would be on Jenkins for many of those reasons you mentioned. Just, you know,
and he still has the season strikeout record for the Cubs at 274 also.
Absolutely, yeah. And I mean, I counted at least 2, maybe 3 years in a row where we're talking over 300 innings. I mean, it's amazing that his arm, didn't fall off by the time he got to the Rangers and the Red Sox later in his career. Studio 411 here with Coach Marv Levy and author, sports historian George Castle talking baseball, as well as some anecdotes and also their joint collaboration, Go Cubs Go. Let's see now, outfield. Again, I'll give you some names. I'll start with the coach first. Toss me a few names from your time, 40s, 50s, 60s, whatever you'd like. Guys that impressed you out in the outfield.
There's a guy named Big Bill Nicholson, who was on the 45 World Series team that was renowned back then. Certainly, oh golly, there's one I'm trying to, Hack Wilson. One time the all-time leader of the NFL in home runs. I think he had 56 when Babe Ruth broke it with 60.
And still has the RBI record with 191 in a season.
That's the major league record?
The major league record is Hack Wilson's 191 in 1930.
Okay.
Interesting.
He knows the history very well. Andy Pafko certainly fits in that group of great outfielders. And there were some guys on those Cub teams back in the 30s. Augie Gallan, diminutive Dominic D'Alessandro, known as Dim Dom Dal, he was about 5'5" and a pretty darn good player. Those are just reminiscences I have. I'm not approaching this at all as a knowledgeable historian. They're just some memories.
Absolutely, absolutely. We're looking at an image here on the monitor. I just wanted to share with the coach an official scorecard, Chicago Cubs, Wrigley Field, 1941. Coach, any idea how much a scorecard cost at the ballpark back in 1941?
A scorecard?
Yes, sir.
I think it was 5 cents. I know that's what a hot dog cost. Now, well, I'm talking about the 1930s.
Well, in 1941 must have been the war inflation was 10 cents for a scorecard, and very impressive. Now I couldn't even tell you what a scorecard costs. I know they say people don't keep score. I think it's certainly a something that's an art form. There are people that just cannot watch a game without keeping score. So it's something.
Larry, I can tell you that same cardboard scorecard cost just 15 cents in the early 70s, so it didn't go up that much.
And what do you? I know George doesn't go to many games anymore, but what does a scorecard go for these days?
Well, we went to the Cubs-Sox game recently at the Southside Ballpark, and our tickets were $50, which are considered a break sitting in the left field and the outfield. That's just unbelievable. But I think that scorecard, or I should say the Sox team program, was like $4.50.
Wow.
It was. You're paying basically a magazine price. So anything you touch at that ballpark, you've got to empty your wallet, as you know.
Absolutely, absolutely. All right, just in a few moments here we have with these two tremendous gentlemen. We're actually looking at an image of the 2016 World Series ring, a nice piece of work to say the least. And I'm trying to read it here, inscribed on the side, Wrigley Field, Cubs win, home of Chicago Cubs, kind of an image on the ring of the famous scoreboard at Wrigley Field, decorated in red and blue Cub colors, and just a marvelous ring. And again, Coach Levy, did you ever think? I know you say never give up, but did you start to think, you know what? I'm not sure I'm gonna see this happen.
No, I never gave up. No, I was hoping that it finally occurred, and it was really exciting.
And that Game 7. Now, were you at the Game 7? I know you threw out a pitch at one of them.
No, it was at Game 4. Cubs lost. Game 3, I should say. First one at home. No, they Cubs honored a World War. A service veteran every game, and they were kind enough to invite me to do it that day.
Now that Game 7, regardless of where you were at Game 7, that was a nail biter. I know I saw the last couple of innings, and that was certainly a high drama as the ratings certainly spoke.
Yes, indeed. I watched it here at home. I live in a high-rise condo, and I heard the hoots and hollering from everybody else in the darn building when it ended.
And George,
don't get me started, gentlemen, on Joe Madden's managing in that game.
Go ahead.
Don't get me started on Joe Madden's managing in that game. I thought I saw the ghost of Leo DeRocher abusing Phil Regan in '69,
wow.
using him every day for 2-3 innings. When he handled Chapman, put Chapman in there until his arm fell off. Pulling Kyle Hendricks probably an inning too soon, but his excuse by saying he won that night, but won in spite of Joe Madden on that particular night.
And lastly, we didn't get to all the positions, but we got to quite a few. Manager, again, I'm going to guess that coach is probably going to throw Charlie Grimm, because I understand he was a manager for 12 years during some 3 World Series appearances, correct?
Okay, I'll go with that one, yeah.
Now, tell me, what about Coach or Manager Grimm, do you remember? A good manager?
Well, I was young, and I was enamored with them all back then, so, that was exciting to hear his name and know he's the manager, and to feel like I was really getting an education, because I could name everybody on the Cubs, including their manager.
You mentioned earlier Billy Herman. Didn't Billy later, he became a manager. I believe he also managed the Red Sox. Is that right, George?
Yes, he did. Billy managed the Red Sox in the early 60s, Larry.
But did he ever manage the Cubs?
No, he did not. In fact, he never coached the Cubs. I believe Billy Jurgis, his shortstop partner, may have come back and coached with the Cubs, but out of that team, Phil Cavarretta and Stan Hack ended up managing the Cubs. but not their middle infielders.
Gotcha. All right, gentlemen, this has been quite an education. Again, we look forward. I know we're going to reach out to Coach Marv at some point to talk some football and also his career.
That I feel more qualified to.
Oh, you've done very well. You've given us quite an education, and of course, George, we know he always brings his A game. So again, the name of the book, Go Cubs Go, Baseball's Never Give Up Story. Authored by Hall of Fame football coach Marv Levy, a devout Cubs fan, illustrated by Rob Peters, special contributions by George Castle, of course, eminent Chicago baseball historian. All right, gentlemen, you hang in there with us 1 second. I appreciate you taking time to join us, and we look forward to having you both back on again.
Thank you very much. Thank you so much.
Very good. And we thank you for joining us. This episode is Studio 411. Larry DeSilva is my name. And we hope you've enjoyed this show. Again, as we see Wrigley Field, home of Cubs, Chicago Cubs. Cubs win. And we look forward to seeing you next time here on Studio 411. Take care.